All right, well, welcome. Oh, geez. Welcome, everyone. I'm Tim Searchinger. For those who don't know me, I'm with SPIA, and I'm very, very, very pleased to introduce our speaker today. In fact, I almost always do things ad lib, but I care so much about this, I actually wrote stuff down. And Danny Cullenward, who is an economist and lawyer, he is focused on the scientific integrity of climate policy. His book, Making Climate Policy Work, shows how political forces make green industrial policy more effective than carbon pricing. He's a senior fellow with the Kleinman Center at UPenn, a senior fellow with the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal at American University, and a visiting faculty researcher at Google. I admire this since I try to have multiple jobs so nobody knows where I live either. He is the author of literally a meaningful fraction of all of the world's leading papers on carbon offsets. It's virtually impossible to do anything with carbon offsets without running into one of Danny's papers, and he's been extremely influential on IPCC panels and otherwise. I like him so much because he is a lawyer, and he's JD from Stanford, but despite being a lawyer, like me, he works on science and policy. Unlike me, he is officially qualified to do so because he holds a whole series of degrees from Stanford, including a PhD in environmental resources, an MS in science and engineering, a BS in earth systems. I mean, a lot of degrees. I've had the opportunity to work with him this year and have learned he has a super, super sharp, clear, and nuanced mind. But the real special thing about Danny is he is fearless. He is dedicated to truth-telling, regardless of convenience or conventional wisdom, and he approaches life as though he feels it is his responsibility precisely to correct problems where it is most inconvenient. So he has my enormous gratitude for all of his work, and I look forward to his talk right now.
Thank you, Tim, very much. That's a very generous introduction. I hope I can at least do right by the ruffling some feathers elements of the introduction. So I want to give a talk today about two carbon markets in California. There are two major carbon markets in California. California is a place that is doing climate policy. It's saying a lot and doing a lot about climate policy. This is mostly going to be a talk about some of the things that are challenging or problematic. So I don't want people to walk away and say there's nothing good happening, because there's an extraordinary amount of good progress happening in the state, particularly in decarbonizing the state's grid, which is going, I think, exceptionally well, and compared to what seemed possible when I was a graduate student, just a breath of fresh air. And I couldn't help but show a picture from a park in San Francisco, taken about 2 weeks ago. Our summer is just ending in San Francisco, where I live. And I'm delighted to be here for just a beautiful fall. I grew up in the Midwest, and I miss peak fall, and I miss thunderstorms, and I'm glad I got at least one of them on this visit. So let me figure out if I can actually move the slides here. So before I get started, a quick disclaimer. I'm the vice chair of California's Carbon Market Advisory Committee, so I just want to make sure I am spouting my own heresies today, and I'm not representing the heresies or opinions of other people on the committee. And I want to open with a brief serenity statement, because we're obviously in a difficult time with respect to climate policy. Some's better than none. That's really important. We need more. And I think one of the things that sometimes gets me into trouble is my sense that we won't get more and better policy without some critical reflection. And I'm hoping that my talk will give you some sense of some of the sort of details under the hood of what goes on in some of these policy environments. And today, I want to acknowledge, I'm going to talk about some things that derive from the book work that Tim mentioned. I wrote a book in 2020 with David Victor about the political economy of markets, and a lot of it was concerned with the political sustainability of pricing impacts and the coordination challenges associated with doing that. But today, I'm going to steal ideas from three of my friends, and I wanted to promote them very briefly because they are seeing things that more people need to be paying attention to. The first person from whom I'm going to steal work is my friend Jess Green, who's a political scientist at the University of Toronto. She has a fantastic new book out this month called Existential Politics. And I'm going to summarize her whole book's contribution in 4 words: count dollars, not tons. And by the end of this talk, I hope you will get some sense about why that's an important way to think about and look at these policy systems. Second person from whom I'm stealing ideas today is my colleague Lihi Yona, who's at Cornell Law School. She has a great paper out about what she calls emissions omissions, but essentially the political economy of greenhouse gas emissions reporting. We often see selective reporting and disregarding of certain emissions, often for political reasons. I will show you some examples of how that manifests in practice and can't say enough about her work. And then lastly, I'll touch on briefly a couple of examples where weird emissions accounting outcomes drive completely screwy and counterintuitive results. And one of the people thinking most clearly about this is my colleague, Emily Grubert, who's at University of Notre Dame. We wrote a paper about implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act about how just a couple of tweaks in weird accounting numbers can get you totally absurd things where you shovel massive subsidies at fossil fuel-fired power plants in the name of climate progress. And these weird, slippery accounting conventions are going to come up all throughout this talk. So these are the three people you should be listening to instead of me. And in all seriousness, this is, really, I think, important work with people who are really at the cutting edge of both theory and practice. And I hope I can give some practice insights today. So I'm going to go quick because I have a lot of material to cover, and we'll have time for questions and answer at the end. But I just want to download a whole bunch of stuff so you can see what is going on. It is a very interesting time in California. I'm going to talk about two markets. We have two carbon markets in the state. There's a market that's now called the Cap and Invest program, used to be called Cap and Trade. It's often referred to as economy-wide because it covers about 3/4 of statewide emissions as those emissions show up in our inventory. And it's a standard quantity-based market where it's trying to sort of set a cap or a limit on total emissions in those covered sectors. We also have something called the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which is a much more complex policy. It's based on life cycle emissions accounting, and it's not a mass or a quantity-based system, it's an intensity-based system. So it's trying to set a declining limit on the average carbon emissions per unit of transportation energy. It only covers the transportation sector, but as a result of these two programs being present in the same jurisdiction, they both have significant consumer price impacts on transportation fuels, gasoline and diesel, which are ultimately one of the more politically sensitive issues that comes up on the implementation side and not just the theory design side. So let me dive into it by talking about the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. I'm going to give some context for where this policy sits in the state's official transportation policy strategy, which has three basic elements. One is reduce vehicle miles traveled. Second is tailpipe emission standards. And the third is the low carbon fuel standard. So essentially drive less, have cleaner cars, and burn cleaner fuels. For engineering-oriented people, you notice the units don't actually multiply together, and that is a weird legal nuance associated with the fact that we are not allowed to set fuel economy standards. The legal justification for California's long-running separate standards on emissions are because they're about pollution per unit of travel rather than the energy efficiency or CAFE standards at the federal level. Long story short, the first two are not going great. The state has a housing and affordability crisis issue. It doesn't actually enforce its soft vehicle miles traveled targets. We're nowhere near on track to reduce VMT, in part because it's very expensive to live where people have jobs. And so we've been building out and out and out and having longer and longer commutes. The state has recently passed some major housing reforms that may start to change that over time, but this is really a housing issue, I think, if you zoom in carefully. Tailpipe emission standards, the legal fights with the Trump administration, I'm not going to go into detail on, but I think the bigger issue is that we have some of the highest electricity prices in the country, in part because we run wildfire liability through our utility system. So it's getting increasingly expensive. Most parts of the country, it is way cheaper to run an EV. That is still true in California, but it is barely true. And I think that's a long-term challenge. All that being said, the state has kind of unilateral legal and policy control over the low carbon fuel standard. And as I'll get into, it's, I think, one of the more profound missed opportunities in the policy system. So how does it work? It's an extremely complicated policy. It's probably the most complicated policy I've ever worked on. But just imagine you had a calculator that magically assigned a number, a carbon intensity score, to every gallon of fuel sold in the state. There is a target intensity in every program year. And whenever somebody sells a gallon of fuel that is more carbon intensive than the target, they incur a deficit. Every time they sell a cleaner fuel, they earn a credit in proportion to the size of the deficit of the credit. And the way the regulation works is deficit generators are legally obligated to obtain credits. So this is essentially a mechanism that tells sellers of traditional gasoline and diesel fuels from fossil sources to acquire credits from anything else that's deemed to be a lower carbon alternative. The other really interesting thing is it turns out in practice, almost all fuels get a custom score, and most of the information is proprietary. So I'm going to show you some weird high-level results. It is hard to go any deeper than this because almost all the information is considered commercially protected. The program was initially developed pursuant to an executive order under an omnibus climate statute. There was litigation that delayed its implementation, was ultimately upheld in court, And it requires various carbon intensity cuts, starting with some modest cuts, but accelerating in the course of a rulemaking adopted late last year to very deep reductions in the carbon intensity of fuels, going down to a 90% reduction in intensity by 2045. That vote was a very convoluted and complicated process. When people caught wind of the cost impacts of this program from the regulator in the spring of 2024, the regulator rescheduled their vote to 3 days after the federal election. And you can imagine not a lot of people were paying attention to the intricacies of a policy like this. And there are a couple of active lawsuits about the calculations and claims in the program. So what does the program do? This is a figure showing in the black dark line the carbon intensity reductions that are required. So we're going to set the state on a lower carbon fuel trajectory. And you will see that initially compliance barely kept up with those targets. People were complying just a little bit more than what was required and barely more so. Until all of a sudden compliance started radically outpacing the requirements of the program, which is weird if you think about it, because we are all struggling to decarbonize transportation. The state is doing a pretty good job on EVs right now, but we didn't all of a sudden clean up our fuel sector overnight, unless you believe the calculations on paper. And what happened in the program is because people were over-complying with the program, they were selling more low-carbon fuels as the calculations in the program deemed them to be low-carbon fuels. A large bank of credits built up in the program, and market prices crashed. They used to be at a peak nearly $200 per ton, which is a remarkable shadow price on carbon, to be somewhat explicit. And they've crashed down in the neighborhood of 50, 60, 70 for the last couple of quarters. How did this happen? Well, many biofuels hit what's called a blend wall. So you can only blend so much ethanol or biodiesel into gasoline or diesel before the engines don't work the way they're supposed to, except for one of the more significant new technologies called renewable diesel. And the main way this happened in the state is we've essentially maintained the status quo in blending ethanol into gasoline. We have some biodiesel blending, but the real story is we have replaced the vast majority of our in-state fossil diesel sales with renewable diesel, which is a drop-in alternative manufactured from various feedstocks. It is essentially chemically equivalent to fossil diesel, meaning that regular diesel engines can burn it. And so what's happened quietly in a way most people haven't seen is that the state is primarily running its trucking sector on biofuels. And that happened very quickly, largely in response, I would argue, to federal mandates to produce biofuels under the federal renewable fuel standard, much of which is dispatched to serve the California market. And that's essentially what crashed our prices and caused the regulator to want to substantially tighten up the stringency of the program to raise prices going forward. This is a figure that shows you the carbon intensity scores of the different fuels, the liquid fuels that are sold in the state. If you look to the very right-hand side, you'll see black dots in a line. That's the target for the year 2024. It turns out that gasoline has about 100 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule. It's not exactly 100, but it's about 100. So you can sort of index to 100 as where fossil starts from. And you'll see that renewable diesel gets a wide range of scores, and that's most of the volume in the program, from between approximately 20 to about 60 grams of CO2e per megajoule. And you see a variety of other scores, again, almost all in the biofuel category here. We are meeting these targets primarily through biofuels, and we're meeting them primarily through claims that specific biofuel pathways substantially reduce the carbon intensity of fuels, including relative to fossil fuels, as well as overall. I think probably in this room, and certainly with Tim present, I probably don't have to go into too much detail about why biofuels maybe don't make so much sense, but just to highlight a few elements. There is a federal biofuel production mandate. We are mostly recycling where those biofuels end up. So if you thought these were better than fossil fuels, I would argue it doesn't really matter if they're consumed in Ohio or California, but our policy accounting structure gives credit for bringing them to California. They're way more land inefficient than anything else, still contribute to air quality problems. I think maybe the most interesting technical debate that's going on right now is how to think about land use change associated with consuming these biofuels. My colleague Hannah Breitz at Arizona State University has some phenomenal papers explaining where this came from and how it was debated. Basically, the numbers are very small. As Tim and others have pointed out, if you disregard the fact that the models assume that people eat less around the world, you don't actually get an improvement relative to fossil fuels. So the main benefit you saw in that slide is really coming from the claim that poor people don't eat, which is a strange way to phrase California's climate policy, but is quite literally the explicit technical conclusion of the numbers. And the other really interesting thing about it is because the state's greenhouse gas inventory excludes biogenic CO2 emissions, which is a standard accounting convention in inventories, This has the practical effect of making our state's transportation sector look like it's decarbonizing, when in fact we're just swapping fossil for biogenic CO2 emissions on paper and arguably not even displacing net fossil emissions when we do so. It gets even weirder. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I wanted to call out these incredibly weird negative numbers, particularly in these blue lines. These are dairy digesters where you install a capture device over a manure lagoon. And the way the state does its accounting is it says there was going to be methane emissions to the atmosphere. We covered the lagoon, we captured the methane, we upgraded it to pipeline quality methane. And it doesn't matter where it is, as long as it's injected into a pipeline, we're going to say that's our methane. We got the good methane. They count the avoided methane emissions. When calculated in terms of CO2 equivalents, the number goes negative. So this is really weird because the state is saying we are essentially removing CO2 from the atmosphere. In practice, what they're saying is we're paying somebody else not to put methane in the atmosphere, but it creates a negative number. And you can get into all sorts of shenanigans with calling things clean. So our rules currently allow people making hydrogen from fossil fuels to claim that a farm in upstate New York is capturing methane emissions with no transmission of the methane from the farm to California, and say that their hydrogen production from traditional fossil methane is not only carbon neutral, but net negative. So these are some of the weird things that happen when you allow this accounting treatment, and the state does. Things get even more controversial and challenging, and this is the issue the state has not yet confronted when it comes to the cost implications of these mandates. And so everything kind of works, even if you get weird and bizarre outcomes if the cost impacts are low. Politically, things get a lot more challenging and real if the cost impacts become visible and significant. I want to walk you through the economics of how this results in a per gallon cost impact and the controversy over that. So to understand the cost implications, you have to understand how the program works. It says every time somebody sells a gallon of gasoline, they have to procure credits to cover the deficit. The deficit is calculated by taking a look at that dashed line near 100, and the deficit is the difference between that and the declining carbon intensity of the program. So you can see there's a pretty modest deficit when the targets are modest, but as the targets approach the kind of climate targets we all want to see in general, the deficits get much larger on a per gallon basis. So every time a refiner sells a gallon of gasoline in the wholesale market, they acquire a larger deficit as the program goes on. The program has pretty substantial potential carbon prices. So they, in the past, have hit their maximum. They're nowhere near their maximum. They're about $50, $60 a credit right now, so they're closer to the lowest line right now. But the maximum is almost 4 times that price level. And when you run out of room to basically recycle in existing biofuel credits, and especially if EVs hit a wall with federal attacks and tariffs and all sorts of other issues, we could easily see market prices go up in the future. So there's a range of potential market prices, and you have to combine the range of potential market prices with that crediting deficit chart I showed you in the previous slide. And this is what the per gallon cost impacts look like. Now again, I'm not telling you what they will be. This is a range of what is possible, showing for those same credit price levels, the kind of compliance cost per gallon that would be associated with the program. 10, 20 cents a gallon is not a huge deal in a massively volatile fuels market. 50 cents, $1 a gallon is a fundamentally different political calculus. This program is capable of producing 50 cent or more per gallon cost impacts pretty soon, right? I'm not going to predict when. I'm not going to get into the game of when our credit price is going to reach certain levels, but you can see even if they stayed at their current very low levels, which I think is not a realistic way of thinking about the future of the transportation sector over the next 10 years, you're already in the mid-20s, mid-30s within a decade. And I think it's much more likely that will stop because we've almost completely displaced our fossil diesel. We have no more sort of biofuel to inject into the system. So I don't think it is possible for credit prices to stay very low forever. And you can see kind of a wide range of possible impacts. You really are not allowed to talk about this in the state of California. This is a LinkedIn post from the Deputy Executive Officer of the climate regulator saying a point that they make repeatedly. They say there is no correlation between LCFS credit prices and gasoline prices, retail gasoline prices. Now, I want to be really precise about this. That claim is technically true if you interpret it incredibly narrowly, because lots of things have impacts on gasoline prices. Many factors do. The question is not whether you can predict gasoline prices from LCFS credit prices. The question is, can you predict marginal changes to gasoline prices from the LCFS credit price, right? Things like refinery outages or the global crude oil market are independent of the LCFS for the most part. And it turns out you can. And so I want to show you, just to give you a sense of where the data are on this. We had a natural experiment in the state quite recently. It appears that beginning in January of this year, refiners started passing along the costs of the higher program regulations that were recently approved, even though those regulations were not supposed to take effect until July. The regulator announces this pattern of behaviors was going on in May, and refiners appeared to have stopped and started using the old numbers in June. So we have this really interesting natural experiment where refiners were passing along the higher costs of the new regulations, stopped for a month, and then once the new regulations formally took effect, started passing along the higher costs again. Just to give you a sense of what this looks like, I have used the regulator's cost calculations, how to do that per gallon deficit and the actual historical credit prices in orange. The solid orange line shows you with the higher program regulations that are now in place. The dotted line shows you the lower line. And sure enough, actual reported information to the state's energy regulator shows in black that everything tracked from January through May dropped down in June when people stopped applying the new rules, and then picked back up again when the new rules legally took effect in July. So we now have pretty good empirical evidence that people are doing exactly what the regulator predicted. And yet, again, just to back up, the regulator's official position is there's no correlation, don't worry about the cost impacts. So I hope that will give you some sense that the politics are not particularly stable. So if you have to sort of say you cannot calculate cost impacts, don't worry, don't look, it's not exactly a recipe for everything is fine. Part of the reason I'd like to tell this story about cost impacts is where does all the money go? It turns out all the money goes to out-of-state biofuels, which is a really weird and counterintuitive finding. Most political systems end up concentrating revenue benefits to domestic constituents, to constituencies that have resonance with local political structures. And for the most part, this is a program that sends money outside of the state for biofuels. In fact, it sent so much money that at the peak of the market in 2021, almost $3 billion a year going to out-of-state biofuels would have been enough to pay for federal tax credits, that $7,500 federal EV tax credit for every EV sold in the state. So when I talk here about sort of wasted resources and opportunities, this is not a small amount of money, this is a very large amount of money. And it's a fascinating sort of situation where the state's official policy is decarbonized through electrification of transport. Our actual policy instruments are primarily moving money to biofuels, and to biofuels we have good reason to believe don't actually produce the climate benefits we hope. So it's a very unstable time for this program, and I think the main issue for me is that unless you engage in kind of overt science denial, you know that the costs are going up. It's a question of when and how high. And rather than plan for that and have a conversation around what an acceptable and resilient outcome would be, the current approach is to simply deny that those costs exist. And weirdly, as the state is encountering some very serious refining problems as its older refineries begin to explode again, which they've been doing a lot recently if you read the news, the state's primary political response is to consider expanding ethanol blends up to 15%. So again, on the ground, what we are doing is a little bit different than sometimes what we say. And that's kind of a challenging set of issues. All right, I'm looking at the clock. I'm going to keep moving here. Second market I want to talk about is the state's cap and invest program. It's often considered a landmark policy. It is one of the few economy-wide cap and trade or cap and invest programs in the world. It begins in 2006 under Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. Initially, the bill that authorized this, AB 32, provided authority for this market only through 2020. To make a very long story short, we have anti-tax advocates in the state of California who successfully convinced voters to amend the state constitution, so we now need supermajority votes for things that look like market-based climate policies. And when some of the challenges of the initial design phase of this market became clear, and I'll show you some data on that in a second, there was a need for an extension bill which was passed successfully in 2017. It extended the state's authority through 2030. And then just this summer and fall, the state negotiated a further extension to extend the program through 2045. So it's gone through some pretty significant political sort of rocky shores and now has clear legal authority to operate through mid-century, which is actually a really incredible accomplishment. Some big unanswered questions, which I will now get into. I think the first and most important thing to say about the design of this program is it's called a cap and trade or a cap and invest program, but the cap has never been binding. People talk a lot about carbon markets as setting limits on emissions. The limits depend on the stringency of the regulations. And I'm showing you here a picture that depicts in orange the emissions covered under the program. So in 2013 and 2014, we just mostly had the electricity sector covered. And then in 2015, we added our gas utilities, our large industrial emitters, and our transportation fuels, which is the bulk of the state's emissions profile. And then in light gray, it's the total number of allowances that are made available every year and actually sold into the market. So you can see in every single year, the number of allowances actually sold at market is higher than the emissions covered in the program. On top of the light gray, we have the blue bars. The state has a very large offsetting program that mostly goes to forest carbon offsets. And that's a substantial additional supply of compliance instruments. And then on top of all of that, the shaded bars are reserve allowances that technically exist in the program. They're available at higher prices. They've not yet been accessed. But you can see on any one, let alone all three of these metrics, emissions have always been below the cap. So the most important thing to know about the program is the cap was never binding. And I would argue it was never designed to be binding. It's not necessarily the end of the world. What it did was produce a low carbon price signal. It also produced a problem known sometimes as oversupply or excess allowance banking, where the fact that the caps were larger than the initial supplies of allowances led to a large buildup of compliance instruments in the market, which put at risk the state's climate targets. So when you hear people say there's a cap and therefore we'll get to our targets no matter what, it turns out that's not true when you have this problem. And this problem is notoriously difficult to address politically, even though it's increasingly able to be addressed quantitatively. And so the result of this is this shows a picture of market prices in the program. Beginning in 2021, we had a maximum price imposed by a price ceiling. We can get into the mechanics of that. We've always had a minimum price called an auction reserve price, which is the lowest price at which the state will sell new allowances into the market. And for most of the market's history, it operated at the price floor. So having a non-binding cap with a whole lot of allowances means you got a low carbon price that was basically a carbon tax. During the zero interest rate days immediately after COVID, a whole bunch of investors moved into this market expecting that it would have a bull run, as had recently been the case in the European Union, which had market prices around 0 to 5 euros, and eventually they shot up to almost 100 euros as Europe implemented a strong series of reforms to address allowance banking. And a lot of people hope that might be the case in California as well. With the reauthorization of the program, there is now clarity to drive this program to substantially more ambitious emissions outcomes over the next couple of decades, and I think changing fundamentally the outlook for where prices might go in the future. I'll tell you a little bit more about that, but before I do that, I'm going to show you some figures on where the money goes in the program, because it's actually really interesting. This is some work I've done for the advisory committee. On the left-hand side, it shows the percentage of allowances and where they end up. And on the right-hand side, I've propagated that through real auction prices, so you can get a sense of how much money is actually involved here. And the basic story is about 45% of the allowances are sold to raise money for a state fund, where it's used for a variety of things, and I'll get into that. And a bunch of the allowances shown in the light and the dark orange are given to the utilities who are required to use these allowances for the benefit of their customers. So this program has done a pretty good job on paper of protecting utility customers from higher costs, because most utilities get more allowances than they quote unquote need. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I just mean they end up getting as much or more units to comply than they require for compliance purposes, which largely insulates their customers from cost impacts. That's good on the utility side. It doesn't happen on the transportation fuel side. And when you sort of zoom back out and you say how much money is flowing, it's close to $9 billion a year. $9 billion is a lot of money. It's a lot of money. You very rarely see state programs operating at $9 or $10 billion a year. In purple, by the way, I should mention, a lot of people talk about giving free allowances to heavy industries that are exposed to trade and are at risk of leakage. About 2/3 of our allowances go to the oil and gas industry, worth a little over $1 billion a year. So most of our leakage protections are really oil and gas subsidies. You could say that they're justified or they're necessary. You could say that they're not. But that whole discussion is a $1 billion a year plus discussion about the oil and gas industry specifically. So we're in this really interesting moment where the state has, in a good way in my view, extended this program and said we're going to have clarity about where this program is going. We are going to drive it to a very ambitious target of a minimum 85% reduction below 1990 levels by 2045. So whereas the state had largely had an over-allocated lax program, The regulator has not yet written the rules to codify what this will be, but the statute says go to this very deep 2045 target. You have the legal authority to do it. And in essence, it's flipping the program from a state of laxity and low prices to a state of scarcity and potentially much higher prices. There's a pretty profound transition that is implied by that. Very few people are writing about exactly what they think the price outcomes will be. A little bit earlier in the process, a UC Davis group led by Professor Jim Bushnell, who are consulting for the regulator, put out a figure in a public workshop suggesting that even without reforms to address the surplus allowance issue I mentioned, prices could head toward the price ceiling in the market by 2030, and certainly by the mid-2030s. So we are, again, according to this analysis, looking at substantially higher prices rather than lower prices. And I think one of the challenges that has really, I think, confounded policymakers is people sort of want the good without the bad. I think analysts and most people in this room would probably understand higher carbon prices means you get more emission reductions, more revenue, and higher fuel price impacts. You don't get to pick and choose. They all travel together. A lot of policymakers say, how do I get the good parts without the bad parts? And that is a really complicated problem to deal with because it is really hard to get people to pay attention to all of them. There's also big implications for the state's fiscal outlook. So what I've done is on the left-hand side, taken the current market design, which allows the price ceiling to escalate at 5% plus inflation per year, and drawn 3 scenarios shown in the orange lines, and then propagated through the current allowance shares in the program, say those get extended in the future in the same way, which they very well may be. You are looking at something in the neighborhood between $130 and $310 billion of value over 20 years. A substantial amount of value that is all contingent on some regulatory decisions about who gets what slice of the pie, whether or not the regulatory structure, the market design with these high prices is allowed, and what the market eventually selects as the prevailing allowance price. This is a ton of fiscal uncertainty. It's a lot of money that can be used for decarbonization or equity benefits or a variety of other things, but you get very different outlooks between 100 to 300 plus billion dollars a year. Very hard to plan for that level of uncertainty. I think very difficult to form clear expectations without consensus around what's the market design going to be and what do we expect is going to happen given the scarcity that's been introduced to the program. So one of the things we don't know and is now sort of before the regulator in a very live way is will they continue as they had proposed previously to address the surplus allowance issue? If you want the state to get anywhere near its emissions goals, and I think that's highly unrealistic at this late point, those excess allowance supplies need to be addressed, but that's going to put upward pressure on prices. So we'll see what the regulator does. Will they keep the same high price ceiling, knowing that there is a substantial probability, I don't know what it is, but it's a lot higher than zero, that market prices eventually reach that price ceiling? Very similar dynamic to the low carbon fuel standard discussions where, as I suggested, talking about the implications on energy prices is kind of a no-go, but kind of a scary thing if it's exposing the whole state to those cost impacts. What will the regulator do with respect to how to slice up the allowance budgets? Right now, about 15% go to the industry, principally oil and gas industry, 40% to utilities, and 40% to a climate fund. You could mix and match those numbers however you like, with, again, extraordinary fiscal implications in the story of hundreds of billions of dollars over 20 years. And I think one of the most interesting features of the program's design is that currently it's protecting and arguably compensating on net utility customers from this program. It's transferring money basically from drivers to utility customers. Well, that's good for utility customers. It's not so good for drivers. And that is right now the main political rhetoric people used. When the governor signed the bills authorizing the extension, he said this is an affordability statute because it's going to drive utility benefits. And that is, again, narrowly true and important to emphasize in a state with critically high utility costs. It's also a state where most people can't afford to live near where they work. So if you are a driver who doesn't own an electric vehicle, there isn't an affordability story here, there's a cost story, and it's a potentially very significant cost story. And one of the great, I think, untested challenges in carbon pricing is how high are drivers willing to let environmental policies, drive costs before you get into challenges? And that is not a fun question to ask and answer, but that is a question that is essentially before this policymaking apparatus, which has 2 very big policies that both push very hard on the cost of liquid transportation fuels from fossil sources without any compensatory mechanisms, and with at least one of them primarily sending billions of dollars to biofuels rather than to electrification or equity-oriented strategies. I think the main message I would like you to take away from the cap and invest story with this reauthorization, which again is profoundly good from the standpoint of moving climate policy forward, but most of what happened in the programs past was a lax market design. Way more allowances than people needed with a ton of very low quality problematic offsets. The program didn't really ask very much of the emitters who were subject to it, and that kept prices at their sort of minimum levels. That was very successful politically, from the standpoint of avoiding any concerns around price impacts and political opposition to that, but it really didn't ask very much. We're flipping from abundance to scarcity with this reauthorization. I think analytically that is kind of unambiguous. I don't think there's really a lot anyone can say to dispute that. But in policy circles, I think there's a perception that because people have been warning about high costs for years, this is just another example of people warning about high costs. And I'm very concerned people are not paying enough attention to the possibility that the current program design could lead to pretty rapid escalations in carbon prices and energy price impacts without careful market design to land a balance between the environmental ambitions that I support and motivate me to do this kind of work and the potential for people to be really upset that they're making it harder to live in a state where affordability is already a major challenge. I want to take just a step back before I stop the talk to give some higher picture thoughts. I like carbon pricing. I think it's good when you do it right. I think there's a lot to recommend it. I wrote a book trying to say how to get as much out of it as you can. It was widely seen as a don't do markets book, but it was saying put markets in their place, which is that it is really hard to put a consumption tax on everybody and everything all at the same level, all at the same time, and expect that to drive most of your progress. And one of the conversations I've been having with especially environmental groups who are interested in trying to figure out, should my state do a cap and invest program? You see this in New York and many other states on the East Coast who are looking at these kinds of policies. Is this a good thing? And my answer is, it can be a really good thing, but you have to land the balance right. And the thing you have to understand about these economy-wide carbon markets is they're basically consumption taxes. That doesn't mean it's bad. In fact, you could write many books about why it's good and efficient. But there's only so far you can take a consumption tax without major equity and political problems. And if one of the reasons we do this is to raise money, which is a perfectly good and valid reason how most of these programs operate in practice, you may need to think about other ways of financing that, like progressive income taxation and corporate income taxation, other sources of fiscal revenue that are not inherently regressive. The play on this story in California is that we are doing transfers through the utility mechanism. And that is good policy, and I will promote it and suggest it is worthy and could be emulated. But in places that have done an even better job, like Canada, that didn't go so well. Canada had a carbon pricing system that would bring all of the money back to people in regular checks, very visible checks. It was very well designed. It was as good as any policy has ever been, and it was the subject of intense and unrelenting political attacks from the opposition party. And when the current Prime Minister, Mark Carney, took office, the very first thing he did was cancel that policy. So a very pro-markets, pro-climate, pro-markets Prime Minister basically reneges on the classic economic textbook example of the best way to handle regressive impacts. And I tell that story not to say no one will ever get it right or it'll never happen, but to just urge a little caution when you say, I've penciled out the numbers and this is good for utility ratepayers. That is not necessarily a political answer. It's probably part of a political answer, but it doesn't mean everybody just says, okay, great, we're fine, moving on. I think the most important conversation, which is basically not allowed in California policy circles right now, is to talk about where the price ceiling should be. There's a very good chance if the state sets an ambitious allowance budget, says we want to get to our target, that we have a good probability of reaching our price ceiling, whatever it is. And the encouragement I've given policymakers is pick a price ceiling that you're happy with. Right now we have a price ceiling that I would suggest, if we reached, would be a political crisis. So I say pick a price ceiling, maybe it needs to be lower than the current one. One of the answers I've gotten from elected officials is you hate climate policy. And my response to that, I just encourage you all to think about this. If you pick a market design where an outcome allowed by the market design is so politically toxic you're not allowed to talk about it in public, that is a good sign you have not picked a politically resilient market design. And I am not here trying to shut you down. I am here trying to make sure your policy doesn't blow up. And that is concerning, right? If you can't have that conversation, including in private, let alone in public. And another just key thing here, there's always going to be political limits to climate policy, particularly explicit market-based climate policies. So given the constraints that are always going to take us back from what we might want to do on paper to address the climate crisis, we have to spend the resources wisely. And I am struck at how opaque these conversations are, how completely inaccessible the dollar flows are, which is why I emphasize my colleague Jess Green's work, count the dollars, not the tons. It's really easy to cheat on the tons. It's a lot harder to cheat on the dollars. And when you trace where the dollars are going, a lot of them are not being directed to activities most people would recognize as common sense climate priorities. And that is a sign, for me, often of regulatory influence, special interest influence, even sometimes, I think this is very clear in the low carbon fuel standard, regulatory capture. So there's a pretty significant history in this program of former regulators going to work for the biofuel industries who get the credits. And I think that's part of the story. By no means is it all of the story. But we have to be very skeptical of our climate policy institutions to preserve their overall function and fiscal flow. Last thing to say, and then I'll close it and welcome comments and feedback and questions. Just to sort of call out my friends who've been thinking about this and connect what I've just told you to some of their work. It is really easy to mess around with emissions accounting. It's very malleable. I love life cycle analysis. I talk to great scientists everywhere. You can make numbers up pretty easily if you want to. And we have to recognize the practice of emissions accounting is political as much as it is technical, and therefore who is doing it really matters. And my colleague Lee Hee-yeon has written great work about this. Count dollars, not tons, that's Jess Green. Just always also be aware it's hard to count dollars sometimes because people don't want you to know where the money's going. So Jess often says it's easier to count dollars. I put a friendly footnote on that and say it's sometimes really hard, but for the exact reasons you should do it because you want to know where the money's actually flowing. And then the last thing, which we didn't spend too much time on, but it is really easy to create emissions accounting loopholes. And those negative numbers I showed you for the biomethane, unbelievable number of loopholes. We were literally, the governor of California wrote into the Federal Treasury Department during the Inflation Reduction Act days saying, adopt the California program, it's great. And you had biofuel industry saying, just let us use the accounting practices that California employs at the federal level because California is a climate leader. This was people arguing for getting the 45V hydrogen tax credit, $3 per kilogram of hydrogen for methane offsets with conventional fossil fuel practices. And how hard it is to peer through all of that to say, what is this emissions accounting? Is it legit or is it a special interest play? And it's very easy for special interests to take this over and with the enormous complexity associated with these programs, promote things at a level of rhetoric that's hard for even sophisticated, interested people to understand. And so I keep coming back to emissions accounting is incredibly political, it's incredibly important, and you can get off on the wrong track if you do it wrong. And that is where I will leave my talk. So thank you.
Super thanks.
I'll stop the share here, is that okay?
Yeah, I'll seal that just so I can keep the recording going. Fantastic talk. The only person I know as obsessed with carbon accounting as I am.
You need to get out more, Tim.
I just want to point out that what's interesting, if you try to pigeonhole Danny ideologically, you're going to have a hard time because on the one hand, he's giving a hard time to people trying to have more lenient offsets through forest accounting. On the other hand, I think incredibly correctly, he's worrying about the price impact and the sustainability of these programs. And that the fact that you cannot define him ideologically, I think is part of the testament to his credibility. I want to ask you one question before we get from the crowd. So what alternative policies, given where these things are, what would you do differently? What would be the single or couple things you would do differently for California?
Thanks, Tim. Just on the cap and invest program, it's the price ceiling conversation. So I would love to have a conversation where people said, here's the price ceiling we want, and if we get there, it's a win, because here's all the outcomes that will happen, and we have a sufficient consensus that that's a good outcome rather than something we shouldn't talk about. So I think that's honestly pretty tractable. I think the problem with that is it's not going to be a hard cap on emissions. It's going to turn into a tax. In terms of its practical effect, I want to say tax is a four-letter word, and no one in politics wants to say the word tax, but it means you have a price instrument, not a quantity instrument. And so much of the state's rhetoric is confounded by that, and I think we just need to get over that, right? Because I'd much rather have a real price that's sustainable than bending over backwards to fake a price. So
let me question you. Part of your point is that we should be taxing, or we should be putting our money, and therefore implicitly the tax, in the things that we care about the most. So is there any tweaks you would make to the structure of the program that would do that?
So let me give two answers to that question. On the Cap and Invest program, I didn't get into this for lack of detail. One of the major reforms in the legislative package was to restructure the spending. So I think politically, like, that was just a big conversation, and I think that conversation landed in a better place than it was before. It used to be that 2/3 of the money was pre-appropriated to various things, most of which had a very tenuous connection to climate. There's still a lot of not really climate priority spending. So $1 billion a year for our high-speed rail program to build a high-speed train from San Francisco to LA. I would love to ride on that thing. I can't necessarily say that $1 billion a year from that program is the greatest mitigation value you could put to those dollars, but that was the political decision taken. So I think there's more work to be done. There's a lot of discretionary spending, so those conversations are going to become part of an annual appropriation cycle that I think will be positive. On the low carbon fuel standard, I think we need to have an honest conversation about how much money we want to light on fire and how much we want to charge drivers for the privilege of lighting it on fire, so that people who consult for life cycle accounting can make money saying the numbers look good in a confidential process. In all seriousness, there are ways to reform it, but right now it is a program that is designed to shovel billions of dollars into biofuels for a period of time, and then eventually the targets get so significant that only those negative number methane offsets and EVs will make sense. But it's basically asking drivers to pay a lot for biofuels between now and then. And I think the fact that that has never actually been authorized by statute, and the fact that it will present real costs that are visible, calls out for some direction. And there's technical ways to fix it if people want, but you have to look at it first.
So questions from the audience, and let me just ask mechanically, will this work now for the recording? No. Okay, so why don't we get questions, then we can restate the questions so that make sure they're properly recorded.
And it is fascinating, but also concerning. It seems to me that a lot of the issues you were talking about, especially with the low carbon fuel standards, partly because California is the climate leader doing a lot more than the other states. So when you do life cycle analysis, for example, you have to draw a system boundary around the state, right? So that's why we're sending money elsewhere. Can you just comment on this? Because I feel that some of the market design loopholes are by design, where you have a climate leader that is doing a lot more than the other state, but some of the loopholes, maybe we can fix it. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the question was about California being a first mover, and also maybe that there's something about California's position that requires life cycle being done in a certain way. So I want to very much embrace the first part. The second part I think is actually a little different than the way you phrased it. So the fact that this was one of the first, it was one of two policies to use life cycle analysis along with the federal renewable fuel standard. And again, my colleague Hannah Breeds has wonderful scholarship documenting this process. People basically invented a lot of the applications for these policies. So no doubt they were going to get some things right and some things less right. And I think that's really important to center, that in any novel policy space, you're going to get some things right and some things wrong. What's been challenging is that getting it wrong can often create special interests that have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. So what I've been really struck by is you can fix all of these things quite visibly, and several states have attempted to do so, and several states are starting to do so in related programs. But those issues are not on the table because of what I would call regulatory capture inside of the system, where you have a small number of very politically influential and very politically active investors who make a lot of money with the status quo, and they're very organized to preserve it. You'd suggested that the life cycle analysis boundaries are related to the state. They're not. They're sort of, you can kind of do whatever you want in this policy. And so if one wanted to take a different approach, as many people have advocated, the state could. The regulator's choosing not to, and I can speculate as to why, but there's no official answer. They've declared that they're doing it right, and I would say that's because special interests are very effective at getting what they want.
Other questions? Rob?
One technical point and one moral point. Technical point is that there's a concept in the whole quantity versus the collar. That you admit that you don't want an all supply or an all price, all quantity all price regulation, and you get a conversation about the ideal zone, if you like, in a two-dimensional space. So why aren't I hearing about that? The moral question is, you said the word's not allowed several times. And it rings a different way maybe than a year ago. And the question is, what are you actually saying? Or who is Muslim who? Now we stop doing that.
Yeah, thank you. So let me start with your first point. So the The technical design of this program includes a price floor and includes a price ceiling. Those are set by statute, the fact that those things exist. That's a hybrid market structure that is neither purely quantity nor purely price. The basic point I'm trying to make is that if you look at the rhetoric of how the state describes its program, it describes it in purely quantity-based terms. I would say during the period of great abundance and laxity, it was a price at the floor, which I think is fine, but it is a price at the floor. And now this conversation I'm saying about maybe you want to set the ceiling at a politically appropriate place, whatever that is, that makes it more price-like. And I think it is fair to say that the regulator has continually emphasized the quantity aspects of the program when it is necessarily a hybrid, and I think realistically looks more price-like in any constrained environment. So I would love to have that technical conversation. I'm trying to observe that politically people talk quantity. Couldn't agree more, and the basic point I'm trying to make here is that is not the technical conversation. This happens in the regulatory process. I wish it were. And then you sort of said a moral point, and I talked about a conversation not being allowed. I was speaking euphemistically. One of the reasons I love working with the East Coast University and visiting places like Princeton is no one here is going to try and chop my head off for saying this stuff, but I regularly receive direct communications from senior regulatory staff impugning my work in public. Elected officials have made it clear they're very unhappy with my work. And I mean, I recently had a colleague, Dr. Barbara Haya at University of California, Berkeley, who's one of the world's leading experts on carbon offset markets. She gave a presentation at an official advisory hearing to the climate regulator. And the number 2 climate staffer came in and literally compared her work to the Trump administration's attack on the endangerment finding, so that the regulator would no longer stand by idly and needed to deploy the same aggressive responses it deploys in relation to the federal government to quote unquote non-federal actors. I've had my jobs threatened by donors in these markets. I've had senior faculty members at various West Coast-based institutions threaten my career and employment prospects for publishing work. So I was speaking euphemistically because this isn't about me, but like when I say it's not allowed, no one wants to talk about where we should put the price in these markets. And I'm trying to make the argument that we have to have that conversation, and not having that conversation is a sign that the policy systems are not as resilient as we need them to be. Take me out of it, I don't really care. Point I'm trying to make here is we got to pick those numbers in a policy process, and not having that conversation, I don't think is going to help us. So it was a long answer to your question, but happy to follow up. It's not fun.
I have a question first before we go there. So one of the interesting things is that you showed that essentially the allowances provided were more than the emissions. So that leads me to ask you 2 questions. One is, why did the emissions go down? And the second is, why was there any kind of a price for the allowances, given the fact that the allowances were greater than the actual emissions?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I'm going to mess up the paraphrasing. I have a colleague, Dave Weisskopf, who loves to do this. There's this poem about, completely forgetting it. I'm going to bungle it, so I'm going to stop. The low-hanging fruit was imported electricity. We used to have a lot of coal power imports in the state, and we shed it. That was the low-hanging fruit. The low-hanging fruit is gone. So that was basically how the emission reductions happened. The electricity sector ditched the imports, and then our deployment of clean resources is going swimmingly. So almost all of the progress, in fact, I think it's more than net 100% of the progress is electricity right now. That's been most of the success. Why do you still have a price when the market is that slack? The answer was because there was a price floor. There was a price intervention in the market design to produce a floor. And we're flipping from like being at the floor to moving toward a ceiling, whatever it is, because of the extension.
So who pays the floor? I mean, if nobody has to buy allowances, where's the money coming from?
They do. So the allowances get introduced at the floor, at auction. A little bit more than half of the allowances are given away for free. All the ones introduced at auction can only be introduced at or above that floor.
More questions?
Yeah, so I have to preface my question with my own ignorance about a variety of things you talked about, as well as in which particular California policy Trump administration is trying to get more back. But I can also see some interdependencies among the 2 policies we're describing. And I'm curious, how much does one rest on the other one? Or is it a house of cards, or is each one actually able to stand on its own? I think about electrification being a really obvious connection between these 2.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the question is, how do the policies relate? Do they stand alone? Are they together? And how does it relate to the Trump administration's hostility in various quarters? What I would say, one of the strengths of the California policy regime is there's overlapping policies. Some people call it belt and suspenders. But the notion is that, if one element doesn't work as well as you hope or fails, the other elements are there. I like that. I'm a sort of pragmatist, so I think that's great. Probably the most important interdependency to call out is that the state is relying very heavily on its waiver from the US EPA to require, essentially zero-emission vehicle sales to dominate new sales in the next 10 years. I hesitate to describe the legal status of that fight accurately, but of course it's a fight and it's not looking great with the overall hostility to the rule of law. So I think the most important contingency there is that the low carbon fuel standard is sort of premised on EVs take over instead of biofuels. And if they don't take over and you're still shoveling money to biofuels, that maybe doesn't look like successful belt and suspenders. Successful belt and suspenders is one policy doesn't do the thing you hoped, but the other policies do the things you want. And I would describe that as a potential failure mode where you're still wasting money despite losing or having an underperforming tool that you hoped you would have, this waiver and the function of the waiver. Best answer I can give you on that, but it's actually a really important question. And a lot of people think we should just have one policy instrument and avoid complexity. I love messy, overlapping things, but they all have to be pointed generally in the right direction. I think we need more thought on that.
What about the pricing in the cap and invest scenario you're describing? How much of the price there depends on the enforcement of the low carbon fuel? Or is that true?
It's so economy-wide that it's sort of hard to say any one policy strategy is relevant, but transportation is the lion's share. And so if we don't get a handle on that, and I've got to be honest with you, if you look at the tons that are expected, more tons come from vehicle mile traveled reductions. So I would say, if you zoom way back out, it's more housing than EVs, and we mostly talk about EVs while we're mostly paying for biofuels. It would be good to talk about housing and EVs.
Last question.
Thanks, Danny. I'm Eric. I'm a postdoc researcher here. Today you talked about two different compliance markets in California, but there are also other markets. I know you served as technical expert panel in the United Nations Article 6, the Paris Agreement and Princeton market. There are also other voluntary market, and so Corsia, the airline decarbonization field. So I wonder, can you elaborate on how you envision those different markets interact or integrate with each other in the future?
Yeah, it's a good question about other carbon markets. So I guess what I would describe is I talked about two compliance markets today, and then there's sort of the voluntary offsets world and the compliance flavors of offsets, including the UN process. Short disclaimer, I'm on the UN technical panel, so I can't comment publicly on the mechanism, and I'm not representing the mechanism in responding to you. I think there's been a general problem with integrity in the offsets markets, whether voluntary or compliance. And I recently co-authored a Nature commentary, came out I think last week or 2 weeks ago, saying it's kind of a mistake to integrate these markets. One of the reasons I work on the UN market is I would like to see good rules happen anywhere at scale, and I'm working toward that there. But I don't think we can point to any large-scale offsetting programs as actually getting anywhere near real emission reductions or real removals right now. So I have been more skeptical about integration, not because I object in theory, but in practice, I don't think we've seen standards reach a sufficiently high quality level. If we did see that, I think there's a conversation to be had, and I'm mostly working on the problems I see with that not happening yet. That's just my answer.
But for now, we also see a lot of countries like Singapore, they do allow 5% or even 10% of those emission constraints in the COMS market. They could use those offset in the voluntary carbon market to reach that. So what do you think of this?
So in the commentary I wrote a couple of weeks ago, we made the point that when a compliance market allows people to comply by buying a voluntary offset or somebody else's credit, if those credits were good, we could have a conversation. They're I would say currently not. But one of the effects it has is it's essentially depriving the state of revenue. It's kind of weird if you think about it. If you're saying have a lower carbon price because you let somebody else buy something from somewhere else, you're really talking about lowering the market price. And even in a tax-based system with those exemptions, you're saying allow the private entity to pay the other private entity rather than to pay the state. And I think it would be more functional and effective to channel the same dollars, whatever price level we want to negotiate on politically, into effective spending programs rather than channel them through these privately mediated finance channels that for the most part are not accomplishing anything. So I strongly favor tackling the financing flows and putting them into good purposes and being really scrutinous about what are they actually doing with that money, and I don't like what I see in the voluntary markets.
Well, please join me in giving a speaker.
Terrific.